Good evening and welcome. I am John Boyle. I'm Director of the Graduate Program in Catholic Studies here at the University of St. Thomas. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the fourth annual Thought and Culture Lecture. The Thought and Culture Lecture Series seeks to bring to a public forum the reflections of the Catholic Studies faculty on the truth and vitality of Catholicism and its impact on human thought and culture. Welcome. There is so much to say about our speaker this evening and so little time. I can but touch on a few highlights because you came to hear him, not me. Dr. Michael Naughton is the Alan W. Moss Endowed Chair in Catholic Social Thought here at the University of St. Thomas. He was also the director of the John A. Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought. He has for many years now organized conferences all over the world on themes related to Catholic social thought and business. In 2009, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in humane letters from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley. Dr. Naughton is widely published, and I won't even try to list his publications here. It's perhaps enough to say that he has been translated into Spanish, Italian, Russian, Hungarian, and Chinese. I do not need to tell the fortunate students and alumni here this evening who have had the privilege of studying with Dr. Naughton that he is an outstanding teacher who brings both clarity and depth to his classroom as he helps students see the richness and significance of Catholic social thought. And with all of this, as many of us know, he is a warm and generous colleague and friend. It is my privilege to introduce to you this evening Dr. Michael Naughton.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for all the work that you do in the graduate program here at Catholic Studies. We're very blessed to have you. This evening, I'm giving this talk in memory of a good colleague, Terry Nichols. Terry's passed away last weekend, and he's a member of the Theology department. He's been a wonderful colleague and a good friend to Catholic Studies. He was also the director of the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center here at St. Thomas. And Terry is a man, I think, in many ways that embodies much of what I'm about to say. A man with a great mind, a great heart, and everything that he did for the Lord. And so we're very grateful for him, and I'd like to, in honor of Terry's life, dedicate this lecture to him. I've been incredibly blessed to be part of Catholic Studies. All my colleagues are a wonderful gift, but I want to especially just call out two of them, Don Brill and Bob Kennedy, who in a sense are very responsible for getting me hired here at St. Thomas. And they have been more like mentors and colleagues to me, and I'm a very blessed man to know them and to work with them. I'd also like to mention my wife, Teresa, who is a current graduate student here in Catholic Studies, and she's been engaging me on all the sources that, all the courses and all the texts that my colleagues teach, which I haven't read. And she has been a profound inspiration on the work that I do, on all that I do, and she's also been very helpful even in this talk that I'm about to give. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dean Maines, I stole his PowerPoint background slides here. So if you see the Veritas Institute, I like his PowerPoint slides, so I use them. So thank you, Dean. I started teaching 30 years ago this year, teaching Catholic social thought. And as I've thought about that, and particularly reflecting upon that for this lecture, I have found that there are essentially two major difficulties that I encounter teaching the Catholic social tradition to students. And the first one is how to enlarge their hearts to see the world in which they are encountering. how to often move, and by the way, not just them, but also how to move me from the kind of smallness of the categories of strategies, the kind of utilitarian calculations, and sometimes often the bland and uninspiring categories in which they think. I'm struck by Augustine when he says in the Confessions, he says, "The house of my soul is too small for you to come to it. May it be enlarged by you." So this idea of trying to have an enlarged vision of life, Pope Francis speaks about believing with the heart, a heart that's able to see a much larger world. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is related, is how to enlarge their minds. Because many of these students are going into a professional world, and it's a very complicated world, and it's a very difficult world, and they have to operate very complex institutions. And the question is, can they enlarge their mind in such a way that they can see these things as not just simply utilitarian calculations, but there's something else that's operating. So in light of that challenge of this enlarging one's heart, enlarging one's mind, I'd like to do two things tonight. First is I'd like to focus on this power of the imagination within the Catholic tradition, since I think it's only within this power of this imagination that one can have enlarged minds and hearts, and that has the possibility not only to transform my students as well as myself, but also the world. And then I like to move to a kind of concrete application of this to explore the power of the imagination in the Catholic tradition and how it can be operationalized, in particularly in its relationship to the principle of subsidiarity as it relates to the question of the institutions that many of us labor in. So trying to focus on that area. So, part one of the talk, the imagination. I like to begin this part of the talk with a quote from a woman named Barbara Ward. Barbara Ward was an economist, a British economist. Back in the 60s, she was actually doing sustainable development before anybody even understood the word. And she, I think, captures, in many respects, the heart of the Catholic social tradition, particularly in terms of this idea of this imaginative vision. And Ward says this. She says, "The most important change that people can make is to change their way of looking at the world. We can change studies, jobs, neighborhoods, even countries and continents, and still remain as we always were. But change our fundamental angle of vision, and everything changes. Our priorities, our values, our judgments, our pursuits. Again and again in the history of religion, this total upheaval in the imagination has marked the beginning of a new life, a turning of the heart, a metanoia, by which men see with new eyes, understand with new minds, and turn their energies to new ways of living." It seems to me she captures exactly what the Catholic social tradition is about. It's about an upheaval in the imagination. It's about a metanoia, an enlargement of the heart and mind. To do what? To see with new eyes. To understand and judge with a new set of minds. And to act with energies of new ways of living. This seems to me captures this important point of the imagination. And yet, unfortunately, as many of you know, for those who've ever done anything on the imagination, this word itself is a difficult word for us even to entertain. Because most people believe imagination is simply about make-believe. It's about that which detaches us from reality rather than connect us to reality. It's a kind of abstract exercise, people will often say, where one gets locked up in the mind. And yet, it's more than that. It has to be more about that. Someone like Barbara Ward, as well as others, are thinking about this in a different way. Cardinal Newman writes about the imagination as a power of the soul, which does what? It intends upon the deep memory of recalling to mind that which is often absent to be made present. This deep memory connects us to the creative purpose of what we're made for. Matthew Kelly often talks about being the best version of ourselves. It is to remember that, because our biggest problem is forgetfulness, is amnesia, and we often forget this deeper reality. Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger speaking to the U.S. bishops, said this about this idea of memory. He says, from its origins, man begins to resonate with some things and clashes with others. This original memory he speaks about, what he uses the Platonic term amnesis, which results from the godlike constitution of our being, is not a conceptually articulated knowing, not a store of retrievable contents, Benedict says. It is, so to speak, an inner sense, an imaginative sense, a capacity to recall so that the one to whom it addresses, if he's not turned in on himself, hears an echo within, and he says, that's it. That's what it's like. That's my best version. That's my best self. That's the way the world should be. This, it seems to me, is exactly what the Catholic social tradition should be trying to tap into, a religious imagination that doesn't lock us into our minds, but rather it serves as a bridge to connect us to the deep memory that's within us and in the world in which we find ourselves in. The sacramental imagination, right? More specifically, it's where we can see the visible sign reveals the invisible reality. And this sacramental imagination gives us the ability to see the invisible in the visible. Let me see if I can put it in 3 different ways. That is, this Catholic imagination helps us to see in 3 different ways. The first is it helps us to see things whole and not just parts. The imagination is an organic way of seeing things in relationship to each other, as someone like Newman speaks about. It's an enlargement of the mind. It helps to see things in relation to each other and helps us to encounter it. It's not just simply an accrual of information, but it's a growing unity of knowledge. As Newman says again, the imagination helps us to see things whole because it provides a creative perception of reality. And it provides a deep, as John Paul II talks about, it provides a deep human ecology to see things and things in relationship in terms of the human spirit. This is exactly what a university education should be attempting to do. But of course, we often have the counter. Alistair McIntyre has argued that universities have instead provided us an unimaginative, highly narrow, specialized training that has produced minds incapable of evaluating the conditions they confront. They are incapable because of their specialization creates a syndrome of disconnection from other disciplines, and thus things are objectified. And McIntyre, in a rather provocative article, argues that this problem, this kind of specialization of the universities, has, in a sense, resulted in some of the remarkable crises that we've dealt with in the last several decades, such as the recent financial crisis. And which is very interesting. If you know anything about the financial crisis, lots to be known. But you take a company like Enron. Enron actually used a consulting firm called McKinsey to get their college graduates, to get the people to come into it. They were from the most highly trained, the brightest people you can get, and yet they could not see the whole. They could not see the full ramifications of these things. These failures, and there's been many of them, the Iraq War, the Middle East, the growing inequality that we're dealing with, the Iran Revolution back in the 70s, these failures, again, McIntyre says, are a product of misjudgments of an intellectual elite often trained in the most prestigious universities. What they lacked was not specialized training, but a larger habit of mind, which would allow them to interpret the complex and converging realities, especially in terms of how these institutions would impact the common good. So first, the imagination is to see things whole. Second, the imagination is to help us see facts and value and not just numbers. Let's be very clear. It is extremely important that all of us are data-driven. We have to confront facts, data, the science, and if we don't, we're not dealing with reality. But this drive to be data-driven, to be, in a sense, empirical, has created a kind of overemphasis on this to think that somehow numbers exhaust reality, that numbers are the thing that will get us to be wise. As you often find, even here at our university sometimes, slogans such as, if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist, right? This problem, this fixation on data, in a sense, drives the spirit of things out of what it looks at. And in a sense, as we even, in a sense, are trying to measure everything at the university, we have measurements upon measurements upon measurements. What we find out, of course, is that we've driven the spirit of education out of our students and the love of education out of those students. Einstein once put it this way: not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And thirdly is the idea of seeing beyond neighbors to fraternity. Pope Benedict put this quite clearly in an encyclical Caritas in Veritate, and he said this. He says, as society becomes ever more globalized, it makes us neighbors, but does not make us brothers. Reason by itself is capable of grasping the equality between men and of giving stability to their civic coexistence, but it cannot establish fraternity. This originates in the transcendent vocation from God the Father, who loved us first. At the very heart of the Catholic imagination, particularly in terms of the Catholic social tradition, is to see the image of God in the other. And yet, we sometimes find it so difficult in which to do it. Let me give you one quick example of this. I know I haven't given many yet. But there's a man up in Montreal. His name is Robert Ouimet. And he has a company up there. It's a food processing company. And this idea of fraternity and how it animates the way he understands the company. And he has a policy. It's about 350 employees. He has a policy that when a manager fires somebody or lays them off, and he says, there are times when you need to fire people, and there are times when you need to lay people off. But when you do it, you have a responsibility that you need to meet with that person twice after you've fired or laid them off. Why did he say that? Two reasons. One is he felt that his company wasn't just simply a collection of interests, but it was actually a community of persons. And this person was in our community, and we want to see how they're doing afterwards. But here's the second reason. The second reason is that he says he wants to provide opportunities for reconciliation. Because when you fire somebody or lay them off, they, in a sense, leave with great animosity. And he was a man, a very committed Catholic, who believed in the importance of reconciliation. And this was a way in which he could, in a sense, engage his employees in a way that, in a sense, saw the image of God, even when they were, in a sense, no longer with him. So these are the three things, I think, at the heart of the Catholic social tradition, this Catholic imagination it's attempting to do. There are lots of challenges. There are plenty of challenges. Right now, the challenges, in a sense, that undermine this imagination are many. Certainly the ubiquity of technology and the fixation on technique. As many of us skim through life through our screens, there's a sense that we, in a sense, no longer take deep dives, and thus we can't see an imaginative way of looking at life. We have all sorts of addictions: workaholism, pornography, alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling, all of which, in a sense, eliminate and do great damage to the imagination. Workaholism, which is probably the most socially accepted addiction that all of us have, is a problem because often people who are workaholics are bored with everything but work. And if that's the case, the imagination has been obliterated. But what I'd like to do is simply focus on something else. I'd like to focus on this problem of ideologies and how ideologies distort the imagination. Many people are often weary about the Catholic social tradition because it too often can get hijacked or hitched to an ideology that short-circuits the deeper understanding of the issues at hand, right? Because an ideology will always give itself in kind of a preset, predetermined reality, and in a sense puts things in a particular box. Let me highlight two ideologies that I think are often we find within our society. The first one is the logic of the contract. It often tends to be more a leftish, liberal, progressive ideology where the fundamental fixation is on the political. There's often a naive confidence in this logic of the contract, thinking that the state can solve all the problems that we have. If we have just one more law, one more set of regulations, justice will be done. This logic of the contract actually has some, I would say, debilitating understandings about how we even understand our economic system. Often in law, for example, a firm is simply understood as a bundle of contracts. It seems to me that the big debate that's going on in the Supreme Court right now over the HHS mandate concerning the company of Hobby Lobby is that if you look at some of the court decisions and some of the way the government thinks about it, it doesn't see the company as a moral enterprise. It simply sees it as a bundle of contracts, which is why they don't think religious liberty is being violated by a company like Hobby Lobby, who in a sense finds itself in a very difficult position providing abortions for the people who work for them. This logic, now, by the way, let's be very clear. The logic of the mark of the contract is a very important contract, is a very important idea. But the Catholic social tradition is not a libertarian tradition, so it understands the importance of laws, processes, and procedures. But one has to be careful of trying to get more out of laws, processes, and procedures than what can be gotten out of it. Because ultimately, as von Balthasar says, if we are simply focused on law, duty grows cold. Law can only take us so far. The second problem, or the second logic, is the logic of the market. And here it tends to be a more conservative logic. It tends to be founded, that you'll find in certain people who, in a sense, often, in a sense, preach the importance of the free market. But let me give you a line that came, I did an interview, or did a survey of Catholic business schools several years ago, and there's a guy from the finance department, and he said this to me about his other finance colleagues. He says, if I believed in God as much as they believed in the market, I'd be a mystic. Right? There is a sense that often people are attempting to think that the markets can solve all our problems. We justify subliving wages, gaping inequalities, inhumane working conditions, all because why? It's simply a market wage. The logic of the market is deeply ingrained. Again, the market and the logic of the market is a very important logic, but it will always distort the imagination by simply reducing people to simply utility maximizers. Again, I want to be very clear. These two logics are very important, but what they do is they tend to always reduce people to exchanges. And they fail to understand the deeper understanding of relationships. And this is why Newman is absolutely correct when he says, the real battles of life take place within the human imagination. And maybe sometimes the distortion of that human imagination. So, ideologies as a problem. The second problem of the imagination is what I would call abstraction, and I think that it kills the practical imagination. One of the dangers of the Catholic social tradition is that it is often perceived as highly abstract, and particularly its principles. It's very interesting in Pope Francis's recent letter, Evangelium Gaudium. He says this, he says, we are in danger of turning our great social principles into generalities which challenge no one. They become mere platitudes. They don't land anywhere, and people simply don't know what to do with them. As one friend of mine, who's the former dean of the Santa Clara's Business School, he says, we seem to have a sense of what to yearn for, but behavioral specificity is thin. Or another CEO who once said to me, he says, how would I know if the common good bit me? Right? How would I know it? Right? And by the way, let me be very clear. This is not to blame the popes and bishops. This is to blame us academics who have done a very poor job translating these ideas into the way that institutions, in way in which these institutions can operationalize them. So the power of the imagination, it is not simply a conclusion, but it ought to always lead us to action. So what, in a sense, can be responded to these problems? It seems to me that at the heart of the Catholic social tradition and at the heart of the Catholic imagination is not a logic of contract or a logic of the market, but it's the logic of gift. And it's this logic of gift which is the soil of the imagination, which gives us a vision to see things whole and to see the deeper image of the world in which it's been created in. I'm always struck. I was in Calcutta back in 1995, and I actually met Mother Teresa when I was there. But one of the things that you find always amazing when you go to a place like Calcutta, when Mother Teresa went to Calcutta, she saw something most people didn't. And if you've ever been to Calcutta, you understand the utter almost miracle of what she saw. She saw the beauty in the poor. She saw a love in the poor. She saw the image of the poor. When I was in Calcutta, I was overwhelmed by the utter destitution and poverty. But she saw it. She had an imaginative mind to, in a sense, see something, and that moved her to do something. That's the imagination. That's the imagination at work. And this is, it seems to me, is exactly what the Catholic social tradition is attempting to do, is to reveal the logic of the gift within the world. And the role of the Catholic social tradition, and it's very interesting, John Paul puts it this way. He talks about that the social doctrine of the church is an indispensable means to evangelization. And he says the reason why this is so is that this doctrine points out the direct consequences of the message in a life of society and situates the daily work and struggles for justice in a way that Christ can be seen. So this idea of the imagination, how can we move it to something more specific? And so what I'd like to do is talk about these direct consequences, particularly as it relates to this principle of subsidiarity. And what I like to do is also particularly focus as it relates to the organization. But let me just say a few things about, as an introduction to this principle, which is kind of a major principle in the Catholic social tradition on subsidiarity. It's very interesting. There's a man named Charles Handy. He's one of the great, he's a British management guru. He writes in the Harvard Business Review. And it's interesting that he's written about he's written about subsidiarity, but here's what he says about subsidiarity. He says, subsidiarity is an ugly word. Is an ugly word, he says. But once you have learned how to spell it, and once you got your tongue around it, you'll hopefully never forget it, right? And I think that's true. It's a word that most of us, in a sense, don't know quite what to do with it. But I hope, if I'm lucky, it will be something that you won't forget until after this lecture. I shouldn't have said it that. You will not forget it after this lecture. This is what happens when you go off the script. You start. Let me say a few things about subsidiarity. One is the history of it. It was introduced by Pius XI in 1931, and it was, in a sense, brought into the lexicon of the Catholic social tradition, been talked about ever since. And the reason why it was brought in, because of the historical situation at the time, you have a growing totalitarian movements in Europe, communism, fascism, nationalism, and they all sought to have the state to what? To absorb the gifts, to absorb the functions of family, of the church, of education, of others. And Pius saw that as obviously a massive problem, and that he, in a sense, used this principle as a way to protect intermediate associations, particularly the family, business, religion, education, from this, what he would call unjustified loss of authority of these institutions. And that's why the very meaning of the word, the etymology of this word, comes from subsidiarium, which means to help or assist or strengthen. And so just from this word, what we find out that there are certain ways in which we help, right? We can think about a passive way of helping or an apparently passive way. You allow people to simply exercise their function. You get out of the way. You give them space. You give them the resources and the opportunities in which to act. And if they can't act for themselves, you try to get active and you try to strengthen those folks in which they do it. And so when we think about acting or helping people, as the principle is attempted to mean, we can, in a sense, find ourselves in two ditches. One is we can find defect. That is, we can, in a sense, fail to help people who, in a sense, need help. We can have a laissez-faire attitude, which, in a sense, fails to recognize people's situations and say, do it yourself, knowing that they actually can't do it themselves. Or we can, in a sense, be excessive, as Pius was particularly concerned about the communism and fascism and the dictatorial issues, in a sense, doing things for people that they should be doing for themselves. So these errors is what subsidiarity is attempting to, in a sense, deal with. Now, since 1931, certainly even before, but since 1931 and forward, much of the conversation over the idea of subsidiarity was related to the state. And what I like to do, however, is talk about subsidiarity in relationship to the organization. Whether it's the business, hospital, university. That is, how can subsidiarity be a principle that can actually apply itself to an organization and how that organization is set up? I will say that the work that I'm about to provide for you right now is a work that I've been working on with Ken Goodpastor, Dean Maines, Jeannie Buckeye, and Patty Pravinsky, of a paper that we've been trying to do this, in a sense, taking this idea and relating it to organizations. And the way that I like to do it is I'm going to use, as I started off with Barbara Ward's quote, to use it in the traditional way that the Catholic social tradition often approaches things, of what they call the see, judge, act methodology. And so let's see what it looks like. What does subsidiarity mean in the organizational world? Judge it in terms of getting a deeper understanding of the principle, and then seeing what this might look like operationally. Okay? So, first, seeing. The idea of seeing subsidiarity. One of the key challenges of the Catholic social tradition is that when you speak about a principle, you have to find ways in which to locate it, because otherwise it remains abstract and in generalities. And so if we were to think about the idea of subsidiarity and its relationship to a business or a university or a school or a hospital, you have to say, well, where is it located within that organization? And there's a document that Dr. Kennedy and I were involved in called The Vocation of the Business Leader. And when they speak about a business, or I would say any organization, it speaks about it in terms of three goods. And it talks about the idea of a goods which are truly good, and services which truly serve. It speaks about good work, organizing work so that workers can develop their gifts and talents. And it talks about good wealth, creating sustainable wealth and distributing it justly. So if you think about subsidiarity, where does it get located in the organization? And what I like to do is focus in that it gets located precisely on this notion of good work. What subsidiarity wants to try to get at is, in a sense, to give people good work. And that's going to be the focus of where I want to go with. So what do we mean by the question of good work? Now, by the way, let's be very clear. The first role for anybody is actually just to have a job, let alone to have good work. But the church has always been clear. We are not just about, people should not be just about creating jobs, but creating good work. And so what does that mean? And how do people look at this? Here's some interesting data that comes from largely with the Gallup organization. And they point out that in most organizations, close to 70% of the people in U.S. corporations, in a sense, are either disengaged or actively disengaged from the work with which they do. Matthew Kelly has another great line on this. He calls them Q&S people, people who quit and stay. You know, how long have you been working here? 20 years. When did you quit? About 15 years ago, right? There's a sense that there's often a great stagnation in which people find themselves in many of the organizations. The costs of this engagement that Gallup points out are extraordinary. In a Gallup study, they found that employee disengagement impacts American businesses with an annual cost of disengagement ranging from around as an estimated $450 billion to $550 billion. And here's what they say. They say companies with engaged employees outperform those with disengaged employees as measured by lower employee turnover, less absenteeism, fewer safety accidents, higher employee satisfaction, faster growth, healthier margins, better customer relations, and fewer quality defects. This idea of the financial costs are certainly part of it. For financial costs, as we should be clear, always entails a human cost. And I think the human cost is best described by Pius XI when he said this. He says, too often, for dead matter leaves factories ennobled and transformed, while men are corrupted and degraded. It is an extraordinary thing, isn't it? To go into a manufacturing company. We used to have the Ford plant down in Ford Parkway. To watch all that stuff to go into a Ford plant and come out a brand new truck. It's an extraordinary thing. But Pius's point is, but why is it that people go into those factories and come out degraded, right? He's trying to get at the point of the very important idea of good work. So the question we might ask is, why do people find themselves disengaged in the work that they do? There's lots of reasons for this, but it seems to me that much of it has to do with a failure of logic of leadership. When leaders are in organizations, and by the way, we have to give them a break because leaders are always facing problems. Life never goes easy. There's always problems. Matter of fact, Frank Schwinn, who was the CEO of Schwinn Bicycle back in the 50s, said this. He says, being in trouble and being in business are the same thing. The day you're out of trouble is the day you're out of business, right? And there's something about that we have to recognize that people are dealing in trouble. But here's the interesting point. How do people respond to their troubles when they're in trouble? And this gets at this idea of the logic and this idea of the temptation. And one way in which people do it is they get fixated on rules, hearkening back to the point that I said about the logic of contract. When things are not going right, a lot of leaders say, make more rules, make more laws, sign more contracts, get more procedures. If we can't get people to do the right thing, we can force them to do it by simply getting them to do more things. And what they often do is they take refuge in these procedures because often these procedures, in a sense, let them escape the very important reality of making judgments. And so this idea of making more rules is something that is often debilitating to organizations. It causes people to, in a sense, check out. The second issue that often we find is that when you, in a sense, have problems, you get fixated on incentives. And this goes back to the logic of the market. If we can't get people to do this on their own, let's incentivize them to it. And thus, we have a whole system of incentives in which to do it. I serve as the board chair of a small manufacturing company here in the Twin Cities, and I'll often go to conferences concerning the work of the board. And it's very interesting listening to consultants talk about how you have to drive your CEO to get them to do what they need to do. And I thought, if you got to drive your CEO, you got the wrong CEO, right? You almost feel as though you're, in a sense, on the farm driving the cattle, right? This is often the logic of incentives, that we drive people to do what they need to do. Now, it's very interesting, right? Many of them will say, but this is the way the world is. This is what it means to be practical. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, said this about this point. He says, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Right? That often we think that this is being practical and we think we're just being practical. There's often much, in a sense, that's underlying that so-called practicality. So again, rules and incentives are not in themselves bad, but they tend to demoralize professionals by often having them move away from a deeper logic into a logic that simply can't engage the reality. And thus what happens is, when they get into these logics, they fail to see their employees' gifts. They fail to see that they are actually inherently gifted. And thus, they also fail to see a genuine community of the work that they have. So, brief picture on the seeing of organizations today. Judging. And judging with this idea of subsidiarity. And what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to talk about the deep theological roots of this principle that we call subsidiarity. In the Opus College of Business here at the University of St. Thomas, we say that we are educating highly principled global business leaders. And the question is, what are the principles that help us make good judgments? And I would say that this principle of subsidiarity is a very important principle for any leader as they look at their organizations. A couple of things about this principle. Benedict, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, said this about subsidiarity. He says, subsidiarity respects personal dignity by recognizing in a person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. That is a wonderful definition of subsidiarity, that I can look at the other and I know they have a capacity to give. And so at the heart of subsidiarity is not a right to autonomy, but rather a munera, a gift to be given. What does that mean? Subsidiarity is often meant as a sense of saying, you basically allow people you give them a sphere of autonomy to do what they want. That's not how the Catholic tradition understands it. The Catholic understanding is, in a sense, I think, best captured by a man named Russell Hittinger. And he wrote a wonderful article actually on subsidiarity, an article that Bob Kennedy put me onto, where he starts to reveal this, and he gets at this very interesting word called munera. In fact, the first time I ever heard that word was from Jason Atkins in a thesis he did for Catholic Studies for his master's thesis. And this idea of munera is so critically important. What Hittinger says, or what he writes about, is that when Pius XI introduced subsidiarity, he decided to make very clear that rights are not derived from human nature abstractly considered, but rather from human nature as already bearing this idea of munera, this idea of giftedness. On this view, rights flow from antecedent munera, this idea of gifts, and hence it is quite different from the idea of rights as being immunity or being autonomous. There's something about the rights that is, in a sense, to protect the munera, not to protect people to do whatever they want, but to protect the absolute giftedness that people find within it. Hittinger, it seems to me, helps us to resist the temptation of reducing subsidiarity to simply a right to autonomy, to self-determination dictated by mere choice. Subsidiarity within the Catholic social tradition articulates a deeper theological root structure that is articulated actually in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it says this: God has not willed to reserve to himself all exercise of power. He entrusts to every creature the munera, the giftedness that they are capable of performing according to their capacities and their own nature. And then it says this mode of governance, this mode of leadership ought to be followed in social life, that those who govern human communities should behave as ministers of this divine providence of protecting the munera of the people that they guide. This, it seems to me, is a major theme that all the popes have been talking about. Not only beginning with Pius XI, but John Paul II introduced this wonderful term called the law of the gift. Benedict XVI talks about the logic of the gift. It is exactly this image of giftedness that ought to, in a sense, enliven how the social tradition can be understood. So what are the implications of this for workers? For workers, they are bearers of gifts, and allowing these gifts to flourish is the truest kind of employee development. Karl Lubeck, who was the founder of the Focolare movement, and of course also a movement that founded 800 companies through a program called the Economy of Communion, says that the person in front of you is a gift. Your employees are a gift. And if one has the lens of giftedness, leaders can see employees in new ways, and to see them not simply as human capital or human resources, right, as people to simply be exploited and used, but to see these persons that they have much to give and they have much to gain. So this is, it seems to me, the principle of subsidiarity in its deep theological rootedness. But this logic of gift also has a complementary logic that we call the logic of justice. And here, a couple of points to be made. Pius XI constantly talked about the idea that it is a grave evil and a disturbance of right order when leaders and authorities rob people of their gifts and their corresponding responsibilities. It is interesting, right, that when we think about robbing something, we always think about robbing things. But we don't think about the idea that we may be robbing people's gifts. John the 23rd put it this way. He says, if economic systems lessen a man's sense of responsibility or rob him of opportunity for exercising personal initiative, then such a system is altogether unjust, no matter how much wealth it produces or how justly or equitably such wealth is distributed. I think that's a very profound, important point. And these are not just popes speaking about this, but it's also business leaders. A man named, some of you may know him, William Pollard, who was the CEO of ServiceMaster. And by the way, he was not Catholic. But here's what he says about subsidiarity. He says, we must, as leaders, embrace the principle of subsidiarity. It is wrong to steal a person's right or ability to make a decision. If we do so, it will ultimately cripple the firm. So, the principle of subsidiarity. This is the principle of judgment, both with a deep theological character of a logic of gift, but also with a logic of justice. So, move to the act. I'd like to use a framework to help us understand about how this principle can be operationalized and acted upon. And this comes from a colleague of mine, Ken Goodpastor, who talks about that when one moves into institutions, it's helpful for them to think about it in terms of orientating, institutionalizing, and sustaining. Orientating is that you take this principle of subsidiarity and you try to find a way to bring it to a kind of secondary level, to ways that, in a sense, makes it more applicable. The second one is institutionalizing. You have to find practices and policies and structures that enflesh the principle. And three, and the most difficult of all, is how do you sustain it? So let me highlight these three as well. First, orientating. Orientating is, in one sense, a bridge between the judge principle of subsidiarity in terms of how it gets acted upon. And I would say there are three ways in which to understand subsidiarity. One is to define the work broadly, design in participation, and avoid centralizing and micromanagement attitudes. The second is to teach and equip, that those who are often closest to the work often know the most about the work, especially when they are educated and equipped. And three, that one goes beyond delegation to trust, to take upon oneself in full trust the risk of the lower levels decision. So these ideas of, in a sense, are attempting to move into an organization, move into the logic of the way a leader would think about things. Matter of fact, particularly this last one, beyond delegation to trust, Bob and I served on a committee for this document, the vocation of the business leader, and we had a CEO on that committee. His name is Pierre Lecoq. And he was the one who actually hit this point very hard. He was a man who was actually attempting to practice subsidiarity. He was the CEO of a $2 billion manufacturing company that had 12 plants around the world. And he says, I know I can succeed. I know I succeed best as a manager that when I can trust the people that I give my decisions to. I take on that risk, but that trustedness develops a key sense of the relationship. Now, he also points out is that these ideas are very important, but there are lots of tensions when you go into an organization. Let me highlight three of them. One is the tension between freedom and authority. This principle is an attempt to say give as much freedom as possible and as much authority as necessary. But let's be very clear, you need both. Freedom without a framework of authority is always in danger of turning into chaos through an undisciplined sense of empowerment. And yet authority without freedom results in the kind of conformity of repression. Two, the idea of trust and accountability. Charles Handy pointed this way. He says, trust has to be earned, but in order to be earned, it has to be first given. And thus they are often in tension, because sometimes when you ask people to be accountable, they think they're not being trusted. But we know that sometimes the two are absolutely, they need each other. And thirdly, the idea of decentralization and centralization. Make as many rules as necessary, but to ensure as much initiative as possible. That is, subsidiarity doesn't take away tensions. It doesn't take away troubles. And whenever you're in an organization, it doesn't give you a flat demand to do things, because this principle will always be in danger of confusion, misapplication, and distortions. But this is simply reality. This is simply the world in which we find ourselves in. No principle is going to do all the work for you, and you have to sometimes deal with that ambiguity. So, orientation. Two, institutionalizing. I said, Handy says that subsidiarity is an ugly word. Institutionalizing is an ugly word. We don't like the word, but I think it's a very important word. And let me define it. Institutionalizing is to infuse with moral and spiritual value beyond the technical and legal requirements of the task at hand. That is, how do you, in a sense, infuse moral and spiritual value in the organizations that one finds oneself in? Many people don't do this, and this is often what we have mission drift. This is why often organizations look alike, because people are simply in a default system. There's no value system that's operating into it. So it's the idea of subsidiarity, in a sense, institutionalized in a company has to deal with a couple of issues. Let me highlight a couple of them. One is the importance of job design. Here's the question. Do we start with the priority of persons and their giftedness in terms of how we design this work? Or do we simply start with the priority of capital? I'll give you a concrete example of this. There's a manufacturing engineer in England. His name is Howard Rosenbrock. And here's what he says. It's a very interesting thing. He says, if engineers would design jobs as if people were robots, they would design more humane work. Now, why would he say that? Here's why. He says engineers have no problems designing jobs for people where they only use 5 or 10% of their capacity. But they would never do that for a robot. That would be wasteful. You use the full capacity of the robot in designing that work. But somehow we find ourselves doing the same. We do this for people. We only use a small form of their capacity. So this idea of, in a sense, this idea of seeing the giftedness of the person in front of you and the importance of this. This is why sometimes, and it's not always the best way of doing it, but certainly sometimes organizing work based on teamwork, in a sense, skilling up the work, making it more like craft work, and having people more involved in this. The second issue that often relates to organizations is often how you have employee development and formation. Here's an interesting point always to ask an organization. How much of your resources are allocated to your people? I do a lot of consulting for healthcare, and I've talked to some people in the healthcare, and they say they actually give very little. Matter of fact, the Department of Defense often gives far more. It's a very interesting question. How much money do we use and how much resources do we do to strengthen people's capacities? And in a sense, to help them become, in a sense, to see the hidden value of often what's found in there. So we can go through some more, but I know I've been going on for quite a while, and so you could look at some others as well in terms of institutionalizing. But let me just turn to the last point of sustaining and the difficulty of sustaining this project. Because some organizations actually, in a sense, get their companies to a point where subsidiarity is enfleshed in it, and they do one really wrong thing. They hire the wrong people. And key to all of this often is recruiting and hiring people, in a sense, who embody those principles. Mission-driven hiring. And this can kill organizations and deflate organizations when we fail to hire on the principles in which we have. It is one of the biggest sustaining modes. If you want to sustain these things, you have to hire for it. So let me conclude. I've gone long enough. And I don't know what it is, but right, an academic has to have a matrix somewhere in their organization, in their presentation. I don't know what it is. But let me go back to the importance of these principles. This insight of the imagination, in a sense, helps us to understand that reality is often of a dual structure. That is, in order to understand one principle, you often need another principle to help you understand it. If we are to understand freedom, we need to understand truth. They need each other. Faith and reason need each other. Human dignity and the common good need each other. Rights and duties need each other. Work and leisure need each other. The same thing is true for subsidiarity. It needs solidarity. Whenever you look at the Catholic social tradition, subsidiarity is often coupled with the importance of subsidiarity. Here's what Benedict says. He says, the principle of subsidiarity must remain closely linked to the principle of solidarity and vice versa. He says actually that subsidiarity without solidarity gives way to social privatism. That is, when leaders create a place of work where the diversity of talents are exercised and yet close themselves off to solidarity, they risk fostering a workplace that is increasingly self-referential, that is increasingly entitled, and that fails to understand its customers, its students, its patients, and the people that it's there to serve. And yet, solidarity without subsidiarity always has a tendency to give way to a paternalistic social assistance. This is what Benedict says. It tends to lead to centralization, to conformity, to a bloated bureaucracy. When organizations build solidarity but without subsidiarity, they risk creating cultures that, in a sense, have external conformity as the kind of fundamental mark to it. And yet, if we have neither subsidiarity or solidarity, you have a joyless place that actually doesn't usually last very long. But when we have subsidiarity and solidarity, when we have each other, they represent a unique opportunity for what the church is always talking about, integral human development, a continuing strengthening the mind and the body and the spirit in a social interaction to provide meaningful work in which to serve the larger community. When subsidiarity and solidarity work together, they generate a deep complementarity and a mutual enrichment. So finally, at the heart of the logic of gift, at the heart of the imagination, is a paradox of human experience, namely this, and this comes right out of Gaudium et Spes. A person cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. True subsidiarity, along with solidarity, by its nature, assists in this discovery. It helps us to see that an organization can be an authentic community of persons when it serves those outside it, which is the basis of serving those and developing those within it. So thank you very much.
Dr. Naughton has kindly agreed to take a few questions here. We have a little bit of time. I'll let him field his own questions.
I have 2 slides afterwards. I'll just summarize with. Yes, please.
I'll jump under the bus first, I guess. Regarding a few steps back at the human imagination bit, can you talk a little bit about the difference between something that, when you talked about seeing our neighbor, you mentioned caritas and veritate, being neighbors doesn't necessarily make us brothers. I was struck from a quote from Dickens, who said that the modern sort of philanthropic attitude of his time and ours is seeing our neighbors through the wrong end of a telescope. That it's very easy to love humanity in general, but it's very hard for a person to pull their earbuds out and actually talk to the smelly human being sitting next to them. No offense. So I'm wondering, how does the church, you talk about balance here at the end, how does the church balance out a broad picture of humanity as brothers with the specific duties to the neighbors that were given in this particular community?
The one thought that came to me as you were speaking is Lord Rabbi Sachs. I don't know if you've read any. He's a wonderful, interesting man. As he points out that we've fallen into a world where it's easy to love in general. It's easy to love the poor, easy to love humanity, right? And yet we find ourselves that we can't even do small, simple things such as being chaste, right? Or, in a sense, engaging people. So there is an interesting problem there. I don't know how, it's a broad question. I don't know exactly how to respond to it. It seems to me that I guess it goes back to that quote or the story I mentioned about Mother Teresa. It's precisely in a kind of spiritual receptivity that gives us the capacity not to respond to our neighbor as simply a neighbor. It gives us the capacity to see that they are actually made in the image of God. For most of us, we forget it. And so being grounded in a kind of spiritual soil, prayer, liturgy, Sabbath, it seems to me that gives you the capacity to respond on a day-to-day basis, that your neighbor is not just your neighbor, but they're your brother and sister in Christ. And it's hard to do that on a day-to-day basis. And yet we're called to do it, and to redo it, and to repent, and to ask for forgiveness, and to continue to do it. So I think Benedict's point is that we never want to simply look at our neighbor as only our neighbor. I'm not quite sure I'm getting a good answer to your question, but we'll see what we can do with another question. Please. Right.
Mine piggybacks off of him.
Very good.
The whole time I was listening to your lecture, I could not help but think of Sabbath in the back of my mind, that these things that you're proposing would take time. They would take to get to know people before you can make a judgment about what would help them. If you're working with a third world country, or if you're working with business in America. And I wanted to know, do you think that this would be successful without rest, or without Sabbath, or without worship, or silence, or this other thing that would help complement it?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, a lot of people often say, and it's true, they look at the principle of subsidiarity and say, well, reason can tell us something about subsidiarity. It's a reasonable principle. But what they often don't understand is that it's a reasonable principle because there's a faith tradition that actually supports it. And once you sever the question of faith, it doesn't mean that people can't get to that, but they can certainly never get to its theological rootedness. Let me put it another way. We'll never get work right unless we get leisure right. We'll never get Monday right unless we get the Sabbath right. Remember what I said, subsidiarity and solidarity have to be understood with each other, but so does, and your point, Laura, is exactly right, so does work and leisure, work and prayer. And I think underneath the church's social understanding, which has a reasonableness to that it can, in a sense, engage the world. The church is not a sect. It can speak to the world, but it also speaks from a world that it has a deep theological root system to it that actually provides the ability for it to speak so reasonably. So I don't think, I think the world is, it will grind you away to such an extent that all these principles, in a sense, eventually get lost. Particularly in business. Business has become such a highly competitive, highly commoditized environment. If you don't have deep spiritual resources for you, it will eat you up, and you'll simply fall into a default system. And in a sense, it will, as I think it was Churchill, somebody once said, you are to influence institutions, and institutions influence you, right? There's that dynamic there. So all I would agree is, I think I would confirm exactly your insight. The Sabbath is critical, prayer is critical. But sir, you've been patient.
Coming at it from kind of a business perspective, as I was listening to this, I couldn't help but think and wonder how these different principles might apply to different kinds of industries. And I'm wondering if there are some industries or goods that we have today that, well, some industries are easier to apply subsidiarity to than others. Are there goods that we have now or industries that we use every day that you simply couldn't apply subsidiarity to the workers and still have that good? Would there be things we'd have to just do without?
Sure, so if I'm clear on the question, is there certain places where subsidiarity becomes a very difficult principle in which to apply? I'm sure, certainly some places are more difficult than others. But again, often it's because of a lack of imagination. A lot of people would say, listen, you go back many years ago and you look at an assembly line system. How do you get subsidiarity in an assembly line system? It's just mechanical repetition that any monkey can do, as they would say. Well, sure enough, what happened? You get people like, you had the Scandinavians participating in this, Saturn was quite big on this. They, in a sense, started to redesign the assembly line system based more on a craft system than simply an assembly line system. Because actually they were finding that the quality of an assembly line system was pretty despicable. Because when people are treated like monkeys, they tend to produce products that are kind of made by monkeys. I mean, it's a debilitating kind of system. Now, not all work can be not all work can be, work still has a kind of toil to it. All work has a particular toil to it. So it's not like all work will be fulfilling. But it seems to me that we could always do a much better job in most places where, in a sense, if we see them as giftedness, there's gifted possibilities here. And if the imagination is operating, and particularly when one wants to do much better work, that often situations can be made much better, even though with much difficulty. Yes, please.
What do you think is the best way to form people's imaginations properly, especially young people? How should we attempt this now?
Right. Well, obviously, Laura being an educator, literature is literature at a young age, right? It seems to me that my daughter goes to St. Agnes and my other kid's gone to Trinity. The kind of education that one finds in these types of schools of having art, music, literature, having types of conversations, all of those, I think, in a sense, generate an imaginative mind. I was talking to one person who was telling me that she took an English class, and she said that they actually are not reading literature. They're reading about the theory of literature. And I thought, now that would kill the imagination. Right? So obviously education is a real critical element to that. And obviously the church's liturgical life, sacramental life. I mean, I mentioned this man I know up in Montreal, Robert Ouimet. I mean, it was precisely the sacramental imagination of the sacrament of reconciliation that led him to an idea to follow up twice with employees that they fired. I mean, that didn't come out of reason. That came out of a sacramental imagination. And yet the challenge, of course, is we live in a world that, in a sense, highly compartmentalizes things. We're living in a world where the government is actually foisting a kind of compartmentalization. And so that's why education, that's why the church, that's why the family are the critical places where this type of imagination needs to be nurtured and developed. Yes, Phil.
I can see that this subsidiarity would be wonderful with Catholic or Christian general leadership, or even just some form of spiritual leadership. Would, in your judgment, would it be likely to work without that?
Right. Similar to Laura's question, right? In a sense, subsidiarity, I think, with somebody who has the deep faith commitments, it becomes hard, in a sense, to speak against subsidiarity, right? There's something natural about it. Now, there are a lot of people of goodwill, as the church talks about, speaking to the people of goodwill, where I think subsidiarity, in a sense, makes sense to them. But in a competitive world in which one finds oneself in order to keep this principle on the docket, in order to, in a sense, keep a commitment to this principle, without a deep faith commitment, or at least a deep philosophical commitment, I think it becomes harder. Because again, there's a default system. You got to compete, you got to make money, you got to get the product out the door. I don't have time to think about you. You know, the urgent has in a sense run it out. It's only those people who would hold this type of principle and the deep commitments would say, it's worth the sacrifice. I have to fit it in. So, okay? Yeah. So let me just conclude again with two more slides. One of the great honors in my academic life was that during graduate school, and this being for much of our graduate students, I was asked to begin the collection process for Dorothy Day's canonization. And that was a great gift to me, not only intellectually in terms of my formation, but the spiritual and moral formation. And Dorothy Day's great companion was a man named Peter Morin. They founded the Catholic Worker Movement. And I think the way Dorothy would talk about Peter captures, I think, at the heart of what this lecture is about. And here's what Dorothy said about Peter. He said, he, Peter Morin, did not begin by tearing down or painting so intense a picture of misery and injustice that you burned to change the world. Instead, he arose in you a sense of your own capacities for work, for accomplishment. He made you feel that you and all people had a great, generous heart with which to love God. If you once recognized this fact in yourself, you would expect it and find it in others. The art of human contacts, Peter called it happily. Peter Morin arose in people a profound sense of their giftedness to do great work. And as Dorothy put it, he made you feel that you and all people had great and generous hearts of which to love God, causing an upheaval in the imagination that there is great good and that has been given to us. And God's love is there for us to be called to make this a better world than what it was when we first came here. Dr. Brill would always say to me, he would say, there are often at the end of the day, there are two kinds of people. Those who are grateful and those who are resentful. Those who are resentful often have a sense that what they get out of life is what they put into it, and which is why often they find themselves resentful at the end of their lives. They are resentful because that others haven't earned their own, or they're resentful because they believe they've been deprived what they've put into it. Yet those who are grateful often have a profound sense that what has been given to them, they've been given much, and that because of this gift, they've been asked to give much. And this is exactly what is at the heart of the logic of gift. I mentioned that this talk is in memory of Terry Nichols. And Terry Nichols is a man of great gratitude, and he's been at great gratitude to the very end. He's a man who embodied a Catholic imagination in how he worked and served others, especially the poor. He showed me, and he showed many others, of how to work and how to give, of which I am so very grateful, and he will be very missed. So eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naughton. What a remarkable example of what we do in Catholic studies. Before my final thanks to Dr. Naughton, I would invite all of you to join us. We'll have a brief reception. If you want to talk to talk to Dr. Naughton, father only to his children, like to talk to Dr. Naughton. Afterwards, we're going to have a little reception at Sitzman Hall on the corner of Summit and Cleveland Avenue. It's a chance to talk to him. If you have a question that we didn't quite get to, please feel free to join us. Otherwise, thank you, Dr. Naughton. What a great gift for us this evening, your talk. I think I can speak for everyone here. We are most grateful for your words. Thank you.